Welcome back to our Dornsife Dialogues Fall Series. This is the first event of our Fall 2020. I hope you all stayed safe and healthy over the summer and managed to get a little relaxation in there one way or another. 4 years ago, this fall, I watched the presidential debate between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton with my then 4-year-old daughter. And the next morning when we were driving to school, I just mentioned to her, I just said, if Hillary Clinton wins this election, she'll be the first woman president. And from the back seat, my daughter goes, "That's weird. Why?" And I instantly realized there was nothing in her world up to that point to suggest that women were anything but as likely or even potentially more likely to hold important jobs than men. And I instantly felt sad, and I wished I hadn't seeded that kernel of doubt there for her. Last week marked the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, a right that we've now held for less than half of our nation's history. Women have become tremendous leaders and change makers, but there's still far too few women making it to the highest levels of leadership, especially in politics. This year, I don't plan on pointing out to my now 8-year-old daughter the mind-boggling reality that this is the first time in history a Black woman is on the major presidential party ticket. I'm going to let her just see that as something normal. I just hope it's the first time of many, and that we're finally changing the game. Today, we have a terrific panel of leaders and experts to give us an inside view of how women are reshaping our politics. Our moderator today is Professor Ange-Marie Hancock Alfaro. She is the Dean's Professor of Gender Studies, a Professor of Political Science, and Chair of the Department of Political Science and International Relations. Ange-Marie is a globally recognized scholar and pioneer of intersectionality theory, exploring the effect of overlaps in identities, including race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and gender. And she's also a deeply invested teacher and mentor to our students. In addition to being a leader in our Dornsife community, she's an engaged leader within the local community as well. She's a consultant to advocacy organizations seeking to apply intersectionality to the issues they're working for, such as marriage equality, economic justice, immigration rights, and women of color movements. I should also mention that I just learned that she designed the original business model for the WNBA, the only women's professional basketball league to succeed in the United States. So without further ado, I'll turn the conversation over to Ange-Marie, who will introduce our panelists. I'd like to thank everyone again for being on our panel today.
Thank you, Dean Miller. It is wonderful to be a department chair under your leadership. It is important to me that we also recognize that Dean Miller is the first female dean of the Dornsife College of Liberal Arts and Sciences here. So it's been a pleasure to have her as our leader. I want to welcome everyone. Just as Jim said, please be sure if you have questions to put them in the Q&A box. I'm not going to say an extensive introduction about any of our panelists, because if I did, I would use up the entire hour, because this is an extremely and incredibly accomplished set of women who will be speaking to you today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a very short kind of explanation of who someone is, let them talk, and then as their experience is kind of talked about over the course of the hour, you'll learn much more about them. I know, especially for having served on a panel with Senator Boxer before and having spoken with Representative Walters, the stories that they're going to share are going to say far more than I could about an introduction. But what I do want to just point out is, again, as Dean Miller mentioned, we are in the moment of possible serious change. Certainly with regard to what we saw in 2018 and the numbers of women who ran and won seats in Congress at the federal level, both Democrats and Republicans, women of color, in addition to majority white women, certainly did wonders in 2018 during the midterm elections. And so one thing we're going to absolutely talk about is what it means to be a woman running for office. We're also going to talk about, of course, the 19th Amendment in terms of its application to today and the ways in which 2020, again, the year of the woman voter, seems to keep persisting, right? Whether it's soccer moms in the 1990s, whether it's security moms or hockey moms in 2008, or whether it's now and looking at women of color and trying to turn them out, we certainly have this idea that women voters play a powerful role in our electorate. And so we're going to talk about both sides of what it means to be a woman in US politics today, and I'm very excited about it. So our first speaker is going to be Professor Christian Phillips. Professor Christian Phillips is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations, and she is author of the forthcoming book, Nowhere to Run, which looks at candidates running for office who happen to be women. So Professor Phillips, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Ange-Marie, and I'm honored to be on this panel with these incredible leaders in all of their fields and talk to you a little bit today about some of the things that I've seen in terms of where we're heading in 2020 and how that reflects on some of the patterns that we've seen over the past few election cycles. You know, as Ange-Marie said, our conversation about the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, you know, I actually think it sounds very different than it even sounded in late 2019 when there began to be a drumbeat about the 100th anniversary coming. I feel like the events of the last year alone have really turned that into a much more rich and nuanced conversation than I even imagined we would have last August when we first started really talking about it a lot more in public. And I think that part of that is because we have had election after election that has been called a landmark election for women, right? In 2016, we might have had the first female president. In 2018, there was incredible energy and excitement around more women running for federal and state office, including women of color. And in 2020, we're about to have the first presidential election following, I think it's fair to say, a very unprecedented few years of social action and public discussion around the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, and other really pressing issues in our society, in addition to the global pandemic that's really shaping all of our lives in ways unknown and unfolding that, right now. So in thinking about what I'd like to do is give you a little bit of a sense of the landscape of the 2020 elections from where I sit. And I'm going to talk mostly about House races, because I think that's where a lot of interesting stuff is really happening, and also where the Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers University has provided just a wonderful resource for lots and lots of data for really understanding where women are running and how they're doing. So I want to thank them for all of the great data that I'm about to share with you. So I think there's two key questions that people want to know in terms of women running for office in 2020. Are there more women running, and are they going to win, right? So are more women running? Yes, absolutely, at the federal level. And it's very exciting to see what's happening in terms of the House races. There is a big jump in Republican women running in primaries that we saw over 2018. And Democratic women are at about the same number of women running that they had in 2018, which itself was record-setting. And what's interesting, particularly from the work that I do, is that women of color are a larger percentage of these candidates than in any year previous. And so among those women running in primaries, right, 46% of the Democratic women were women of color, and 40% of Republican women running were also women of color. And those numbers, if you aren't already following along, these numbers should pop out at you as pretty astounding. At the same time, it's always important to keep our eye on the baseline, right? We're talking about a percentage of two parties that do still primarily run men as most of the majority of candidates, right? But there is clear progress being made in terms of the number of people getting on the ballot for these House races. So now we're at a place where things are starting to heat up for the general. We've got about 4 states with primaries still to go. With that, where we are right now is that it looks like women will be a much larger proportion of nominees in the general election for Democratic seats, for the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. At this point, nearly half, about 47% of Democratic general election nominees will be women, and 22% of Republican general election nominees for the House will be women. And I cannot wait, frankly, to hear more from our other panelists about why they think that is and what they think is really driving these patterns. So then the second question is, do they look like they're going to win? And this for me is a really important question because, you know, one of the central things that I look at in my own research is where women and men from different groups are actually running. And the reason for that is that we know a lot about women's capacity to win once they're on the ballot. We know that women often win as often as men. In some racial groups, maybe even have better odds of winning. The numbers are a little bit different for Republican women, but that may be changing in the last couple of cycles. But none of that stuff that we know about women's capacity to win really tells us whether or not women have the same opportunities to run for realistic and viable seats that either men do or that other women do. And that's what I'm really interested in, because I think that was part of the story in 2018, right? What we saw was that a lot of women were running, but that there were a number of cases where they ran in districts that were very unlikely to elect someone from their party. And that happened in both major parties to very different extents, right? In the end, Democratic women were able to make gains in the House, but Republican women lost ground, right? And that really raised for me this question of where are these women running, and are these the seats that we want to really be supporting women in? Do we need to be expanding where we support women's candidacies? And it's not clear how that is going to shake out this year, but I saw an estimate yesterday from another political scientist, Meredith Conroy, that out of the 78 Republican women who are going to be going to the general as their party's nominee, 6 of them are in seats that are considered safe Republican seats. This is in the House, right? And I haven't seen what the estimates are for Republican-leaning seats yet, or for Democrats running nationally. But I think that's really going to be a pattern that I'm going to be paying attention to, because I think it'll tell us where women are really creating new pathways to run for the House. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. So our next 2 panelists, to many of us, need no introduction. I've certainly followed their careers for most of my life, so it's always an honor to be able to have people that you've kind of watched and seen do amazing things on a panel with you. So I'm going to ask a question and ask each of you to respond to it, but I'm going to introduce you first too. So we have both of our fellows from the USC Center for Political Future joining us today. The first person I'm going to introduce is former Senator Barbara Boxer, who served in an amazing fashion here in the state of California for a long time. I want to say that you were part of the first year of the woman, if I'm not mistaken. So the first, right? We've had like so many of them, but definitely the first. And so we're going to have her answer this question first, and then we're going to have the same question asked of former Representative Mimi Walters, who served again with aplomb right here in Southern California in the 45th district, or 45th district of California in Congress. And so the question I wanted to kind of start the conversation off with was kind of picking up on something that Professor Phillips was just talking about in terms of district considerations, right? So certainly, you know, we have a geographic-based system here. You run for a district in Congress, or you run for, you know, senator of an entire state. And I would just love to hear from each of you, you know, kind of what were some of the considerations as you were choosing to run for that higher office? You know, obviously it wasn't your first race, you know, but what made it important for you to think about the district and the voters in that particular race?
Well, I'll start off. Hi, everybody, and thank you for including me. I'm sure Mimi agrees that this is a thrill for us to look back at what we've done and look at where we are today. Tell me how many minutes I have, because, you know, as a former senator, you can go on forever. So give me a clue here.
So just a couple minutes, because we're going to go through many questions. Yeah, 2 or 3 sounds great.
Okay. So there's a huge difference between running for the House and running for the Senate. But the same point remains. Is it winnable? I mean, that's basically what you're saying. And I think the professor was just brilliant at laying out some of these problems women are facing, which is they're going into races that are really hard to win, whether they're Democrats or Republicans. So I will say I had an amazing experience of representing a safe Democratic district for 10 years in the very early days. Some of you probably weren't born. It was the 80s, early 80s. And bottom line is, you know, the big fight I had was in the primary, and being able to convince people in that seat, there had been one woman, like in the turn of the century. There'd never been anybody else. And so I had to prove, that I understood numbers. Even though I was an economics major, I had been a stockbroker. I had to make the case that I understood numbers. I had to make the case that I was tough. I had a very tough slogan. I really had to be a fighter, and that stuck with me through my whole career. Running for so yes, this issue, and Mimi can speak to this way better than I for what's happening now. The primaries are tough. You got to get through your primary. When I ran for here's what I did, and then I'll stop. When I ran for the Senate in the first year of the woman, which was a really big overstatement, we went from 2 to 6 in the Senate. They called it the year of the woman. But bottom line is, I ran against 2 guys who were terrific. Mel Levine, who had represented a House seat, and Leo McCarthy, a wonderful lieutenant governor. I was an asterisk in the polls. So this is what I did, and I put it out here as an idea for people. I said, I'm running, I'm different, it's true, but they're 2 peas in a pod. They're just the same. They fought for the same things, and I'm gonna fight for everybody, for children and women. And so I took the negative and turned it into a positive. And of course, Anita Hill was that time. And once she stepped forward, that was an outpouring of support. So that's my answer.
Thank you. Representative Walters, would love to hear your side and how you made these choices.
Well, before I actually ran for Congress, I started out at the local level, and I got very involved in the Republican Party when I first ran for city council. And then I ran for the state assembly, and back then we had the closed primary. And I always ran against men as well. And I always came from a conservative district at the time, and my fight was always getting out of that primary. And one of the biggest challenges that I had was raising the money, because it was very difficult as a woman. I at the time was a stay-at-home mom, and I, like Barbara, used to be a stockbroker, so I was never afraid to ask for money, but I didn't have that network of people to go to, which many of the men had. And so they had a much better opportunity to raise the money, and that was probably one of the biggest challenges that I faced. But somehow, through my work on other campaigns and learning how to campaign and learning what it took to get out of a conservative primary, when I started to build a record of voting, that became very important by the time I ran for Congress. Because by the time I ran for Congress, I had a history of votes that matched the district. Because at the time, my district, the 45th, was considered a safe Republican seat up until this last election. And so I was able to get out of my primaries based on my record. And I often ran against men who didn't have as good of a record that I had. And so I was able to assess the district, and that's how I was able to be successful. By the time I ran for Congress, I had been in office for about 14 years, or actually probably a little bit longer than that. So I really pretty much knew what I had to do in order to win my race for Congress.
Thanks to you both. So I would love to kind of throw this question out, because again, it is still the 100th anniversary here of women voters. I'm wondering from all 3 of you, actually, how do we think about women candidates and whether or not they turn out more women voters? So not necessarily are they more likely to vote for a woman just because they're women. I'm not talking about something that basic. I'm talking more about, are more women engaged when they see, so for example, in Representative Walters, your case, an all-female race, right? So either choice that they make is going to be, a woman who would be in Congress. And so Professor Phillips, I don't know if you've studied that. I don't know if you have some suspicions about that versus, if it's a female male, kind of competition. And then I'd love to hear, what you all thought, Representative Walters and Senator Boxer, about, women, the connection between women voters and women candidates. Do we draw out more women voters?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. I think one of the things to think about is that the experiences of people who identify as women in the United States are not universal, right? And one of the things I've done in my research, for instance, on white women in 2016 is to really think about how different groups of women bring and apply different parts of their identity and their lived experiences to their voting and to their participation, right? And what I find in that work is that different groups of women think about gender and how relevant it is to their participation and their voting in very different ways. So, which is a very academic answer to your question, but I think kind of the most honest one in terms of where we are and thinking about women as motivators. But I also think that there's an important dimension of women being on the ballot that I'm actually particularly concerned about this election cycle, given all of the restrictions on our activity and our ability to gather, which is the sort of much harder to measure impact of women being on the ballot in terms of getting more women to think about their own political leadership and activation, right, and involvement. And the experience of women knocking on doors and going to neighborhoods and being able to talk to voters and see that in-person spark that you can light in someone to get them to go vote, that stays with you, and I think is particularly important in community-based organizations run by women of color that have been doing so much of a lot of the turnout in 2018 and in 2020. And so one of the things I think is really important is thinking about not only whether or not a woman on the ballot turns into women, saying, oh, there's a woman on the ballot, I should go and vote and support her. There's also all of these intangible follow-on effects of having a woman on the ballot and having women engage in the electoral process in a way that feels really meaningful for them.
Well, I'll pop in. What I'm going to say might shock people, but I think it's in line with what the professor was hinting at. I think we're at a point where people vote for the person they want to see in there who's going to carry out the policies that matter to them, that will make their life better as they see it. I lost the white women's vote by a hair every time I ran. I had huge victories with minority women. I lost the white man's vote by quite a bit and had an enormous victory among minority men. Why is that? There's a difference in the parties. Mimi talked about, she joined the Republican Party. I was a member of the Democratic Party. We stand for different things. That's good, that's fine. And in a district, in most of these districts, they're not swing districts in Congress. You're gonna have to battle it out. Now, also what might surprise and shock you is every time I ran, I got a lot of Republican votes. I would have lost. Now, maybe they wanted a woman, especially in '92 when they looked at the Senate and there were only 2 women in the Senate. And there was Anita Hill, and the whole country looked at the Judiciary Committee. There wasn't one person of color, there wasn't one woman in the Senate. So it may well have helped me. I think it did help me get over the line. But let's not kid ourselves. Women are smart voters. They have opinions. They're not all the same. A lot are pro-choice. I was their leader. The ones that weren't, they wanted me out of there fiercely. And, I was for the ERA. There were a lot of women at that point, they didn't want it. So I think we need to be very focused on the fact that, not all women are alike. Not all women voters are alike. And here's where I come down and I'll stop. When I started out in politics in the 70s, okay, and I ran, also, Mimi, started in local office. My only race I ever lost was in 1972. And I just want to give you one feel of what it was like then. I knocked on doors. It was for County Board of Supervisors in Marin County. I knocked on doors, and I will never forget, I wrote about this in my memoir. I knocked on, who is it? Barbara Boxer. What do you want? I'd love to have your vote. I'm running for the Board of Supervisors. And by the way, that was nonpartisan. No one knew you were Republican or Democrat. And the woman said, who opened the door and glared at me, the first thing she said is, I didn't know you'd be so short. That was the first thing I said. I'm little, that's how I've always been. But I'm tough, I said. And she said, and here's the other thing. You have 4 kids. how could you possibly do this and ignore your children when they would be at home? And I said, well, wait a minute. I have 2 kids and they're both in school, and the job is held by a guy who has 2 kids and he has a full-time job. She said, no, you don't. You have 4 kids. I said, look, lady, I don't know if you ever gave birth, but I did, and you remember it. I did it twice. And, you know, that was it. I never got that lady's vote. Now, that changed dramatically by the time I ran for the US Senate. So I think we're in a place now, and I don't know if Mimi agrees. I think being a woman is, you get some people that love it and some people that hate it, and it's probably the same amount. So where that used to be different, when I started, they hated it. They thought something was wrong with you. They would say, what, are you having a bad marriage? Are you a lesbian? Are you, I mean, this is what I used to get. That's, I believe, over. So I think now we enter into a situation where it's even Steven. And that's all we want. We want a fair shot and equal chance.
So, Barbara, you hit the nail on the head. When I first ran in 1996, I got people telling me, you're a mom of 4 kids, you need to stay home with your children. What are you doing running for local city council? So it had not changed that much from 1972 to 1996. And God bless my mother. I love my mother. She's 85 years old. She had her kids in the 50s and the early 60s. And she said to me, you have 4 young children. What are you doing? So I had to say to Mom, hey, listen, I'm doing this. And that wasn't easy. My mom's a tough Irish lady. But having said that, I totally believe we've come so far. And I think with role models like yourself, like Dianne Feinstein in California, the other, you know, obviously Senator Kamala Harris, women of your stature who have done so well for other women in California, I think it's helping bring that younger generation up that are looking at women in leadership and saying, wow, I can do that too. And oh, by the way, I'm a woman and I know how important it is to vote. And what is it that's important to me? One of the things that frustrates me the most as being an elected official, being a woman, was when I got stereotyped. And everybody said to me, where are you on the social issues? Oh, she's a woman. Oh, you know, because I'm pro-life. Oh my God, she's pro-life. I'm not going to vote for her. The same thing happened to me as being a conservative woman. I believe women, by and large, are very concerned of things like security and security for their family, economics, making sure that, you know, there's food on the table for their families. A lot of women are breadwinners in their families, and the whole dynamic now is changing. And I am so thrilled to see more and more women get involved in the political process, and more women are realizing how important it is to have their voices heard. And I think we have an unlimited opportunity for us. And I am just thrilled for, you know, what's happening and the younger generation really taking note. You know, I have 2 girls and 2 boys, and all of my kids were involved in student government in high school and college. And I even had one daughter was president of the college. And so you know, I'm happy that I was able to be a role model for my kids. And I just think we've come a long way. We have a lot more to do, but I like the track we're on.
Me too.
Well, I think I want to get into this a little bit deeper, because I mean, I think it's absolutely the case that people are feeling like we need those role models, right, to kind of blaze the way. And even when we think we've come so far, there's still further to go. So I think both things are probably true. I have a couple of questions from the Q&A that wanted to ask about double standards. So it's kind of an extension of what we're talking about here, right? Senator Boxer mentioned, you know, the guy that she was running against had 2 kids and nobody was asking him to stay home. You know, I mean, but also I want to talk about it in the context of once you got into office, you know, so how did, not just your constituents, but your colleagues, you know, were there double standards that you had to fight? Were there things where, you know, you had to be really clear? Or were there things, and probably both are true, were there things where you felt like being a woman actually provided a certain advantage, maybe that, you know, again, wouldn't necessarily, like having been a mom or having been, you know, a woman who had to fight in a different way for what you really wanted? So I guess I want to hear about both sides of the coin. So Mimi, Representative Walters, why don't we start with you?
Well, when I was in the state Senate, I was the only female out of 14 senators. And then when I went to Congress on the Republican side, I was the only female, I think, out of 14 members of Congress on the Republican side. So I've been used to dealing in caucuses where they were all men and just myself. One thing I will say about my colleagues, they always gave me the respect. I never felt like, oh, you're just a female, that I never got put down. I was always very respectful of them as well. And when I spoke and I had something to say, they listened. And they oftentimes would ask my opinion on things because I gave a different perspective. And I think there were times really when there was like some, you know, difference of opinion happening. And I was able to kind of come in and say, okay, guys, let's figure out how we're going to solve this problem, because you guys going after each other just is not going to work. So I think women definitely bring a different perspective just by nature of our gender and who we are. But I never felt like I was not respected. And yeah, of course, the men, you know, they would like maybe go do stuff together, like fishing or whatever. Maybe I didn't want to go. But I was included more times than not. And I, you know, didn't ever feel, like I said, that I didn't have any less respect than any man sitting at that table.
Oh gosh. Well, I have a little bit of a different story because I started earlier. So if I take you back to the 80s in the House, I'll be honest, it was pretty sexist. And it didn't matter if the men were Republicans or Democrats, it just was. Because there were only, I don't have it exactly right, and Professor, you may have access to the number. When I got there in I got elected in 82, there were 28 women on both sides of the aisle out of 435 people. And and most of the women came there because, poor things, their husband dropped dead or something, so they ran for their seat. That's the truth. That's how women got there. So few women were like Mimi and myself who just did it on our own. You know, we didn't have a dad who was doing it, who preceded us, or a brother or whatever, or husband. So it was not cool. And I wrote about that in my memoir also, about testifying in front of a committee. I was actually on the committee, and it was a very big environmental issue. To make a long story short, there was sexism from the men on the panel toward me, which was ridiculous. And I'll tell you what it was. It was, I said something about how we had to protect the seals, that the baby seals were being clubbed over their heads, and it was wrong. We had to save them. And as one of my colleagues said, who I won't identify, well, I want to associate with the remarks of the Senate, of the Congresswoman from San Francisco. And then he said, well, I'd like to just plain associate with her. I was so embarrassed that I got so red in the face. And with that, the chairman then says, oh, I would too. Another one, I would too. I mean, really? And I was stunned. I was embarrassed. The audience laughed. It was horrific. I got my bill. Afterwards, I went to the chairman, this very old guy from the South, Democrat. And I said, what happened to me was despicable. What? It was a compliment. No. It was awful. And so that's just one example. It wasn't cool. But let me just skip to the Senate and also to the House in this larger term. And I think Mimi would agree with me. Look, not all men are alike and not all women are alike. Some of the men were great, were really good. And some of them tolerated it, and some of them were bad. You've got a whole group of, I would say, mostly white men in the Senate who are giving up power to women. And this has happened since the year of the women I was involved in. Now it must be about 27% of the Senate. So I'll quote Barbara Mikulski, who, oh, if you ever could get her on a panel, she's so funny and fabulous. And she was the first woman, Democratic woman, ever elected in her own right to the United States Senate. Imagine, in the 80s. In other words, all the women prior to, Democratic women, had gotten there because their husband died. She was the first one. And what a feisty person. What a great gal. So she took me aside. She encouraged me to run. When I won, I went to her and she said, Barbara, I want you to know that the guys they fall into a few categories. And she said, what I said, the ones that don't want you there, the ones who put up with you, just leave them alone. And the other group are the Sir Galahads of the Senate. I said, well, who are they? And she said, Joe Biden was one, Harry Reid was one, Ted Kennedy was one, David Pryor. And then she'd say, I'd say, who are the bad ones? And she said, who? And it was very, very helpful. So, but to close, I think what is really good about going into politics as a woman today, I think we've gotten past a lot of that garbage that I talked about earlier. We've gotten past it. No man would dare say those things. No, we wouldn't dare say those things because they'd lose their seat over it, I think. So that's a good thing. But I think where we are now is when you go into politics, it's equal pay for equal work, Mimi, right? We don't get low pay. We get the same size staffs, we blah, 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 same working conditions. So in the sense of true equality, you establish yourself. And in the Senate, I could stop a bill just like Jesse Helms could when I got there. And Jesse Helms stopped a lot of good bills. I could stop a lot of his bills that I didn't like. So they had to deal with you as an equal. And that's why I think it's wonderful, Mimi, that your kids, the girls in particular we're talking about, you know, that they see what you have done and they're attracted to it and they're not afraid of it. And getting back to some of the remarks by the dean, young girls today won't put up with that stuff.
Right.
In other words, if it had happened to me today, I would have said, what are you saying? Take those words down, you know. I sat there in 1983, like, oh, how do I deal with it? You see, even me, who's supposed to be big, tough feminist, I didn't know how to deal. Different times, better times, better times.
Absolutely. I actually want to keep on this topic, and Professor Phillips, I want to ask you a question that came up through the chat and the Q&A. You know, California is a unique place because, of course, we have a top 2 primary. And so we know that, of course, there's been some recent research, Professor Christian Gross, our colleague, just pointed to, that talks about the way in which sometimes women running against men in California, you know, because of the top 2 primary, there are potentially different effects. And so there was a question in the Q&A about term limits, and there was a question in the Q&A about the top 2 primary. So I was just wondering if you could speak to these 2 different policy strategies and whether or not they have any impact on women running for office, women succeeding as they run for office in California, but also more broadly, if you know.
Yeah, and do you mind if I just touch briefly on what the representative and the senator were just talking about? This is something that's really at the heart of some of my work. You know, I talk mainly to state legislators. I've talked to about 700 state legislators or had the opportunity to ask them about these very questions. And I want to say there has been progress. You know, definitely people who have been in office longer say it's not as bad as it was when I first got to, you know, the state legislature in the early 2000s. But I think that there is still a lot of work to be done to think about how people do think about whether women even belong outside of the House and in a state legislative seat or in elected office, right? I still get lots of stories over the past few years of women having either people at the doors when they go and introduce themselves to voters saying, why aren't you home with your kids? Or why haven't, or especially for younger women who are running now and in their 30s, why aren't you having a kid yet? Why, you know, why don't you have a husband yet? Why would you be running for office without having taken care of that first? And then I also have heard some stories about, you know, women having stuff like that questioned by their colleagues once they get to the House and to the legislature. So I think that there are a lot of advances that have been made, but, you know, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that it's pretty widespread across a lot of the interviews that I've had that, you know, gender works both ways. Women definitely tend to talk about gender in terms of their own experience coming up as a candidate and really navigating the legislature for the first few years before they do have some of the institutional power that Senator Boxer talked about, right? That dynamic really shifts once you become a committee chair, right? Or once you have an important position in the caucus. But I think that there's still a lot of work to be done there. And I think that there's also a need to recognize that gender also advantages men, right? And that we need to think about that side of the equation and how those advantages accumulate at the same time. So talking about—
Professor, can I just jump in and challenge you on one thing?
for sure.
And it may be true in the state legislature, and Mimi could talk that better because she served there. But I want to be very clear. In the United States Senate, they don't mess with you if you're a woman. And they can't, because you can cause so much damage. You can shut down the Senate as one person. They don't have different rules for men and women. So it may be, you know, and in terms of the vote, I'm sure there are still some remnants of that Mimi and I face. What do you do when you got kids? On the other hand, there are people who say, I think it's great you have kids. You understand my problems.
Yes.
Go get there and solve it. And I do think that as the years go by, these prejudices should go down. I think the younger the people, the more they see equality. But I could be dead wrong on that. But I think there's a lot of the older people, my generation and maybe 10 years less, yeah, they lived a certain way. So it's threatening to them to see a woman, because they think of themselves, why didn't I do it? Or why are they doing this? But I just see that fading. I don't know. Am I too optimistic and you too pessimistic, or what?
I'd love to hear what Representative Walters thinks.
Well, I would too. She has to break the tie.
Right.
Yeah, no, I actually agree with Barbara. So I'm close to 60 years old, and I think when I started running, there was still some of that old way of thinking, so to speak. But I think my generation sort of started to change that way of thinking. And now we're seeing the younger generations saying, and even the men, I mean, I mentioned I have 2 sons, and they are like, they have girlfriends that are, you know, strong girls and very supportive. And so I just think it's more of an acceptance now with the younger generation. Having said that, you will always, in my opinion, have certain men out there that will want a traditional way of life for their families. You're never going to get away from that. And there will always be a certain thought process with certain men that are elected to office that believe women should not be holding office. I mean, I don't think that mindset for some people will ever change, but I do think that will be more rare as time goes on. And as more women run for office and become role models, the thought process will be forced to change on the other side.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely could talk to you two about this for a very long time. And I think it's a conversation worth having, because I think things are very dynamic, and also the difference between state legislatures and the House and the Senate, I think really does contribute to this conversation. I'll say one brief thing, Ange-Marie, about term limits, and because I have a lot of thoughts on term limits in terms of how they shape candidacy for women, right? I think that one of the things that was really hopeful about the introduction of term limits across a whole number of states in the 90s was that they would usher in new types of people running for office, right? Including more women. And what the political science research has really found is that there was an initial bump, right, in terms of more women being able to run for office, and also more people of color and women of color included in that. But over time, I think one of the things that term limits doesn't address is who is coming after that initial wave of people who've been waiting for a seat to open up. And I think that one of the things that we need to think about is term limits are sort of like busting open a door, right? But doing nothing about that really chipped up, broken sidewalk leading up to the door for some people. Mm-hmm. And for some groups of people, right, it's smooth sailing, it's a well-paved highway up to that wide open door. But for others, it's still very precarious. And I think that term limits are one possible part of a solution, but I think that we have to also think about what we've seen in a bunch of states where there is an initial wave of folks who have been, you know, sort of waiting in the wings or really developing their credentials and their ability to lead in public office. But there isn't enough infrastructure and mechanisms, particularly amongst women of color, to keep those candidates coming through the pipeline and to keep them supported. I think what Representative Walters was saying is really true, that, you know, as we have more women getting elected, we have more women leading these networks. And I think that that's one thing that I found in my own research, is that it does matter who leads the sort of the informal networks of political leaders and stuff within districts and within communities, because they're always, you know, they're going to turn to who they know and trust, right? And we need more women turning to other women that they know and trust and really pushing them up and bringing them along as well.
Mm-hmm. Can I jump in on term limits for a minute?
Sure, briefly, and then we have one final question, and I want to make sure that we get some more questions.
I don't know where Mimi comes out of, so I would love to find out, but I think it's the worst idea ever, ever, ever. And it has nothing to do with women and men. But I can tell you from my hard experience of having served 5 terms in the House and 4 terms in the United States, and it's a lot of time, it's a lot of years, 2 terms as a supervisor. If you have gone into this for the right reasons, and that is to help people, not ideological, I never was, and I don't believe in it. You want to make life better for people. You get better at it as the time goes on. And if you're a failure, there's term limits every 2 years in the House. There's term limits every 6 years in the United States Senate. If some old goat is sitting there and hasn't produced and is falling asleep in his chair or whatever, go after him. I just think these artificial term limits are terrible, and they don't assure that women have better chances anyway. If there's somebody, look, it's been proven. All you have to do is look at the House. They're unseating guys who've been there too long, or gals. So anyhow, I know my position is very unpopular in the buddy politic, and I've always taken it on the chin. I never lost my seat over it, but I always said, I didn't even know where the bathroom in the Senate was for 3 years because it's so crazy, that place. And I got better and better at legislating the longer I stayed, truly.
So I want to pivot just a little bit, although I'm still thinking about 3 years. That's a long time.
That's an exaggeration.
Of course. But no, there have been several questions that I think all 3 of you are kind of uniquely positioned to talk about with regard to what happens when things don't go right. So there was a question in the Q&A about, this person who's running for office in Tennessee, she's not likely to win this time. How do you keep the momentum going? So, certainly for our elected officials, there have been great wins, but there have also been losses. And certainly, Professor Phillips, you've studied folks who are now no longer in office, even after they've won. And so I guess 2-part question. One is, how do you handle attacks, defeats? How do you develop that tough skin? And then the other part of the question is, how do you make the decision to get involved? Like if you were going to give advice to someone who's thinking about getting involved and recognizes all of these hurdles, how do you encourage them and give them advice going forward? Representative Walters, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Well, I've had my share of wins and my share of defeats. I credit my family. I come from a very strong family, a very good family. So when I had those defeats, I was grateful to have my family. Obviously, my most high-profile loss was this last cycle when I lost to Katie Porter. And after I lost that race, people kept saying to me, "Oh, you should run again. You should run again." The number one thing I had to think about after I lost that race is to lose gracefully, and to show my kids that in life, things don't always go the way you think they're going to go. Because I really thought I was going to win that race. And so when I lost, I had to show my kids that it was okay. You take the loss, but you move forward. And that really kept me going because I really felt strongly about being sure that I set a good example for them. If somebody wants to run for office, you have to understand your life is now public. There will be people that want to tear you down. I had people protesting my house. I had people going after my kids. I mean, that's a decision that you have to make. And if you have a family decision, because I think everybody has to understand what they're up against. I mean, they went after my husband, his business, everything. And so you just have to learn that you can't take it personally. And if you have the passion and this is what your calling is and you feel strongly about it, I say go for it.
Yeah, I mean, Mimi has said it beautifully. You need, as Nancy Pelosi often says, politics is not for the faint of heart. You cannot be faint of heart. You have to be tough. That's what I named my book, The Art of Tough. Because if you're not tough, as Mimi said, if you if you can't handle loss, this business isn't for you. Really, it isn't. Because when you run for something, you've got a 50-50 chance. Let's be clear, especially the first time. And sometimes there are wave elections, and you're in the party that's in disfavor, and you could go out, you know, even though you won your race before. Mimi had that experience. I've seen my colleagues have that, definitely had that experience after the assault weapons ban, and then people threw out those Democrats. So it's very important to know getting in. Having said that, what a privilege it is to run. What a joyful thing it is to be able to take a platform that you believe in, whatever the issue is. You know, for me, it always was the environment. It was pro-choice. It was pro-women. It was civil rights. It was all these things that I felt in my heart. And to have a platform to go out and talk about it, I mean, that's key. So I'll close with this. I lost my first race. It was devastating. I will not be a Pollyanna. I lost it. I thought I was going to make it. It was, that's the one where the woman said, you're neglecting your 4 kids. And I only had 2 kids. I lost that one. And I'll never forget, my kids were little, 7 and 5. So I told my 7-year-old, I thought he was going to be bullied at school because it was very high profile. The same thing happened. They were picketing me at churches. It was ugly. And so I went to my son, Doug, at the time. He's so grown up now. And I said, Doug, honey, mommy lost. He said, what? I said, well, you know how it can happen. And I went on. And I thought, I got to protect this kid. And you may get bullied and people go say your mother's a loser and you're a loser. And I don't want you to think it. Don't worry. It's nothing to do with you. And he looks at me and he says, can I have peanut butter and jelly for lunch? He could care less. And I realized then, get it together. It's not the end of the world, Barbara. Wake up. Very last thing, I read an article in Ms. Magazine after I had lost, because I was done with politics. It was hurtful. You know, look, more people didn't like me than liked me. That's not a happy thing. So I was never going to run again. And I read this article and said, women take it too personally. As Mimi said, you cannot take it personally. It may be your year, your party's year. It may not be your year, it may not be your party's year. You may be ahead of the curve, you may be a little behind the curve. Do not take it personally. So with all that said, at the end of the day, if you're ready to be tough and to understand the odds that they're even, Stephen, you know, it's tough. I say go for it because it's an honor of a lifetime. And had I not read that article, I wouldn't have run again, honest to God, because they went through Abraham Lincoln, ran 4 times, and Richard Nixon ran 6 times. And I'm reading all this. I said, all right, I'll try one more time. And then I won 11 straight. So, yeah.
If at first you don't succeed.
Yes.
Professor Phillips, I'd like you to weigh in. And also, you know, again, there have been several high-profile attacks on candidates or on elected officials recently. I'm reminded of one that happened with Representative Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. Certainly some things that happened to Sarah Palin in 2008 and now to Kamala Harris again in 2020. If you could talk a little bit about that and whether or not that also, you know, is typical or is that an outlier? You know, how do we think about those kinds of things?
Oh, yeah, and I think if I can do it quickly, I can tie it into this conversation about coming back, right? So I tend to, you know, have the most in-depth conversations with candidates who are women of color. And these women oftentimes come from organizing backgrounds for civil rights, for racial justice, for immigration. These are not movements that win every day. Right? And so these are women who are very accustomed to the idea of we are going to do everything, we are going to organize, and we are going to connect with other people. We might win or we might not, but our cause is righteous and we will be back. And I think that is what I hear from a lot of candidates who decide to come back. You know, the Center for American Women in Politics has posted some figures on women in Congress who are coming back from losses in 2018 and coming back in 2020. And I think, you know, 15% is what they have right now. And I think that's actually a good number to be building on, in part because I think that we have seen much more of a widespread and public means of attacks on women in public life, right? The attacks on people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, on Kamala Harris and others that are, I would argue, both about their race and their gender, right? Are both racist and sexist. I think are something that if I am working to encourage more women to get into public life, I would be keeping an eye on, right? Because no one wants to go through that. And what's been amazing is that those women have also, right, been involved in so many things in their careers that allow them to, know how to address it when it happens, but also how to continue and push forward and not allow those attacks to define their public agenda, which I think both of the women I just raised have done a really remarkable job of. So I think that is part of one of the things that I find in my own research, which is that when you have a lot of experience, and I think that women from different walks of life and different groups have these experiences in different ways, but when you do have experience organizing and really trying to make a difference, before you get into electoral politics, you're going to lose, right? And you're going to know that today wasn't my day, but tomorrow might be. Mm-hmm. And I need to be here to speak for my community. So that's what I think really drives a lot of women to come back.
Mm-hmm. You got to be tough. You know, I find the best way to battle prejudice is to turn it on its head. When Diane and I ran, 2 women running, we were the first 2 women in history to get elected to the Senate. We were running at the same time for some strange reason that there was a special. So when we ran, we faced tremendous prejudice, 2 Jewish women running. You can't believe the things they said. So we used a sense of humor. Don't forget that. You can always do that. You know, I said something like, if there ever was a time for some good chicken soup in the Senate, we've got so many problems, this would be it. And people laughed at, you know, okay. And Diane would say 2% may be good for the fat content of milk, but it isn't. 2% is not enough women in the Senate. So we would have our ways. And then I would say, you know what? And people would say, I can vote for one of these women, but 2 Jewish women from San Francisco. So, you know, I would say, did you ever complain when 2 Catholic men ran or 2 Protestant men ran? I don't think so. So that's one way to parry it. But when it gets as ugly as it gets, you got to be tough. I mean, Mimi said it, the tough skin, that if you've got to call it out. And if it, and I think the women you mentioned are terrific at that. I mean, they're good at calling it out. And you've got to show that you have that thick skin. In a way, they're doing you a favor. I mean, I'm not a Pollyanna on the point. In a way, they're doing you a favor because you have to be tough in politics. And if you are caught in a situation where someone is really trying to destroy you and you handle it well with your team, with your family, with your friends, and you have a way to do it and you turn it around on that person, you know, just say, you must be a pretty weak guy that you have to go after. What are you doing? You can handle it, but it isn't easy. It is ugly and it needs to stop. And there's only one way to make it stop. More women have to win who are facing this. And once they do, that's where the power lies, you know?
It does. And I'm glad that we could end on that kind of note. There was a question about civility that we weren't quite able to get to because you saw the richness of our discussion today. I think one thing that I wanted to make sure we conclude with is the whole reason for having these USC Dornsife dialogues, from the very first one featuring Bob Shrum and Mike Murphy up to and including this one and the ones going forward, is to really model for the rest of the country and the rest of the world that, yes, we really can talk across these lines of difference. Yes, we really can have conversations that are civil. And yes, we can do so. I'm going to pull a word that Representative Walters just used a few minutes ago about something else, graciously, that we aren't always going to agree, and that can be okay. That doesn't mean that people are, the worst of the worst because they disagree about a particular issue. We can talk civilly. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Please be sure, look in the chat before you log off. We have another one coming up that we'd love for you to join. And I wish everyone a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Wow.
Bye.